Boys and girls, today we're gonna take a trip to a memory lane, to a Jekyll Island. Yesterday we got some mackerels on the way. Today we got some oysters on the way. Man, the Iceland life is pretty good. Although, oyster shells. Although, what the hell is all of this weird shit happening on these islands? What's going on? But there's some good seafood. That's why these guys are probably so smart. Because they understand they need their brains working if they want to get everybody enslaved under their dominance. Absolute dominance. Creature of Jekyll Island. Let's check it out.
After the crash, Teddy Roosevelt, in response to the panic of 1907, signed into law a bill creating something called the National Monetary Commission. The commission was to study the banking problem and make recommendations to Congress. Of course, the commission was packed with Morgan's friends and cronies. The chairman was a man named Senator Nelson Aldrich from Rhode Island. Aldrich represented the Newport, Rhode Island homes of America's richest banking families. His daughter married John D. Rockefeller Jr., and together they had 5 sons. John.
It's a one big happy family.
Nelson, who would become vice president in 1974, Lawrence, Winthrop.
There was that one Rockefeller, I think he was the child of one of these guys. Or maybe he was the John D. Jr.'s son. Anyway, in the 60s or 50s he went to the jungle. He was like, F this shit, F you my family, I ain't taking part of this. He went to the jungle and he stayed in the jungle. That's the base Rockefeller. Like, think about if you are a little base knowledge thinker and you're born into the Rockefeller family, you're like, and they start to freaking groom you from the get-go. They're like, we own everything and you have to freaking do all of this shit to other human beings so we can keep our powers, and if you don't do it, we are gonna freaking do all kinds of weird experiments on you. And he was like, and then you're like a deep thinker and like, you're like, what the fuck is going on? What the fuck is my family doing to Earth? And he went to Amazon, to the jungle, never came back.
And David, the head of the Council on Foreign Relations and former chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank. As soon as
David Rockefeller lived to 102 years old. These Rockefellers, they live a long time. John D, 96. His grandson, 102, bro. Man, the blood is good when you Rockefeller, huh?
National Monetary Commission was set up, Senator Aldrich immediately embarked on a 2-year tour of Europe, where he consulted at length with the private central bankers in England, France, and Germany. The total cost of his trip alone to the taxpayers was $300,000, an astronomical sum in those days. Shortly after his return, on the evening of November 22nd, 1910, some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in America boarded Senator Aldrich's private rail car and in the strictest secrecy journeyed to this place, Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia. With the group came Paul Warburg. Warburg had been given a $500,000 per year salary to lobby for the passage of a privately owned central bank.
Sugar bad eyes. Yeah, those Wahlbergs. They were controlling America and Europe at the same time, boy. Brothers.
In America by the investment firm Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Warburg's partner in this firm was a man named Jacob Schiff, the grandson of the man who shared the Greenshield house with the Rothschild family.
There's some shifts going on, these days even. If you pay attention to American politics, a lot of shifts going on. Are they one big family, one big happy family?
In Frankfurt. Schiff, as we'll find out later, was in the process of spending $20 million to finance the overthrow of the Tsar in Russia. These three European banking families, the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, and the Schiffs, were interconnected by marriage down through the years, just as their American banking counterparts, the Morgans, Rockefellers, and Aldriches were. Secrecy was
one big happy family.
So tight that all 7 primary participants were cautioned to use only first names to prevent servants from learning their identities. Years later, one participant, Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank of New York and a representative of the Rockefeller family, confirmed the Jekyll Island trip in a February 9, 1935 edition of the Saturday Evening Post.
I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would be wasted. If it were to be exposed that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress.
The participants came here to figure out how to solve their major problem, how to bring back a privately owned central bank. But
their major problem, the slaves ain't slaving good enough. How the fuck can we get these slaves slave a little bit better? We got these black dudes over here, they're pretty good slaves, but these white guys and some of these desert folk, they ain't freaking slaving well enough yet.
there were other problems that needed to be addressed as well. First of all, the market share of the big national banks was shrinking fast. In the first 10 years of the century, the number of U.S. banks had more than doubled to over 20,000. By 1913, only 29% of all banks were national banks, and they held only 57% of all deposits. As Senator Aldrich later admitted in a magazine article,
before passage of this act, the New York bankers could only dominate the reserves of New York. Now, we are able to dominate the bank reserves of the entire country.
Therefore, something had to be done to bring these new banks under their control. As John D. Rockefeller put it, quote, "Competition is sin," close quote. Secondly, the nation's economy was so strong that corporations were starting to finance their expansions out of profits instead of taking out huge loans from large banks. In the first 10 years of the new century, 70% of corporate funding came from profits. In other words, American industry was becoming independent of the money changers, and that trend had to be stopped. All the participants knew that these problems could be hammered out into a workable solution, but perhaps their biggest problem was a public relations problem, the name of the new bank. That discussion took place right here in this room, one of the many conference rooms in this sprawling hotel, today known as the Jekyll Island Club Hotel. Aldrich believed that the word bank should not even appear in the name. Warburg wanted to call the legislation the National Reserve Bill or the Federal Reserve Bill. The idea here was to give the impression that the purpose of the new central bank was to stop bank runs, but also to conceal its monopoly character. However, it was Aldrich, the egotistical politician, who insisted it be called the Aldrich Bill. After 9 days at Jekyll Island, the group dispersed. The new central bank would be very similar to the old bank.
Come on, man, 9 days work in a little island, eating some oysters, fucking some beaches, and whatever. It only took 9 days of little spitballing with ideas and shit, and 9 days of manifestation. Were there some rituals involved in there also that we don't know about? 9 days with the boys in the Jekyll Island, and we took over, bruh.
Bank of the United States. It would be given a monopoly over U.S. currency and create that money out of nothing.
Genius.
How does the Fed create money out of nothing? It's a 4-step process. But first, a word on bonds. Bonds are simply promises to pay, or government IOUs. People buy bonds to get a secure rate of interest. At the end of the term of the bond, the government repays the bond plus interest, and the bond is destroyed. There are about $3.6 trillion worth of these loans or bonds at present. Now here's the Fed money-making process. Step 1. The Federal Open Market Committee approves the purchase of U.S. bonds on the open market. Step 2. The bonds are purchased by the Fed from whoever is offering them for sale on the open market. Step 3. The Fed pays for the bonds with electronic credits to the seller's bank, which in turn credits the seller's bank account. The trick is that these credits are based on nothing. The Fed just creates them. Step 4. The banks use these deposits as reserves. They can loan out over 10 times the amount of their reserves to new borrowers, all at interest. In this way, a Fed purchase of, say, $1 million worth of bonds gets turned into over $10 million in bank accounts.
You wanna freaking manifest some success? Take notes. Get yourself with the... Actually, it's impossible for you to do this way anymore, because they have the monopoly. So better get some other ideas. There might be a couple, we talk about those in the later videos, but the answer is only one. There's only one answer. Wait a second, do I have? I don't have it right now. There's only one answer, it starts with a B.
The Fed, in effect, creates 10% of this totally new money, and the banks create the other 90%. To reduce the amount of money in the economy, the process is just reversed. The Fed sells bonds to the public, and the money flows out of the purchaser's local bank. Loans must be reduced by 10 times the amount of the sale. So, a Fed sale of $1 million in bonds results in $10 million less money in the economy. So how does this benefit the bankers whose representatives huddled at Jekyll Island? First, it totally misdirected banking reform efforts from proper solutions. Second, it prevented a proper debt-free system of government finance, like Lincoln's greenbacks, from making a comeback. The bond-based system of government finance forced on Lincoln after he created greenbacks was now cast in stone. Third, it delegated to the bankers the right to create 90% of our money supply based on only fractional reserves, which they then loan out at interest. Fourth, it centralized overall control of our nation's money supply in the hands of a few men. Fifth, it established a central bank with a high degree of independence from effective political control. Soon after its creation, the Fed's great contraction in the early 1930s would cause the Great Depression. This independence has been enhanced since then through additional laws. In order to...
And there you have it, how to slave a humanity. 9 days with the boys in Jekyll Island, eating couple oysters, banging beaches, couple meetings. No big deal. We can come up with this. Well, obviously they had a lot of head start at that point because those were the richest guys back in those days. At least, maybe not the richest, but kinda like the top echelon of the richest people. And then they freaking brainstormed a little bit. They came up with a great idea to enslave everybody. And obviously when they went along with it, they had other genius ideas. And because you can pay some freaking big ass bitch, aka politician, you can pay a couple dollar bills and promise a nice little boat on the lake or whatever, and they're gonna do your bidding in the Congress or whatever. Even presidents, easily controlled, and if they don't, you know what acute lead toxicity does. That's it, bros. That's it, boys and girls. That's how you enslave humanity. On the core level, it's all about propaganda. It's all about deception, manipulation, lies, illusions. Disconnecting people from nature. That's a big part of it. Awesome job, guys.
Fool the public into thinking the government retained control. The plan called for the Fed to be run by a board of governors appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. But all the bankers had to do was to be sure their men got appointed to the board of governors. That wasn't hard. Bankers have money, and money buys influence.
You want boat in a lake? You want little mansion or whatever? You got it. If you do this for me.
Over politicians. Once the participants left Jekyll Island, the public relations blitz was on. The big New York banks put together an educational fund of $5 million to finance professors at respected universities to endorse the new bank. Woodrow Wilson at Princeton was one of...
Yeah, science and the education system, it's really good. It makes the people learning from it very intelligent, high IQ, like super intelligent, and they write these articles that the intelligent middle classes and people can read and educate themselves on. That's core principles of the high standard of living civilization we are creating over here.
The first to jump on the bandwagon. But the bankers' subterfuge didn't work. The Aldrich Bill was quickly identified as the Bankers' Bill, a bill to benefit only what became known as the money trust. As Congressman Lindbergh put it during the congressional debate,
The Aldrich Plan is the Wall Street Plan. It means another panic, if necessary, to intimidate the people. Aldrich, paid by the government to represent the people, proposes a plan for the trusts instead.
seeing they didn't have the votes to win in Congress, the Republican leadership never brought the Aldrich Bill to a vote. The bankers quietly decided to move...
That was kind of stupid move, naming it Aldrich Bill. That was a little too egomaniac. That was your only mistake back then, but they corrected it pretty quickly. They learned from their mistakes.
to the Democratic alternative. They began financing Woodrow Wilson as the Democratic nominee. As respected historian James Perloff put it, Wall Street financier Bernard Baruch was put in charge of Wilson's education.
Baruch brought Wilson to the Democratic Party headquarters in New York in 1912, leading him like one would a poodle on a string. Wilson received an indoctrination course from the leaders convened there.
So now the stage was set. The money changers were poised to install their privately owned central bank once again. The damage President Andrew Jackson had done 76 years earlier had been only partly repaired with the passage of the National Bank Act during the Civil War. Since then, the battle had raged on across the decades. The Jacksonians became the Greenbackers, who became the hardcore supporters of William Jennings Bryan. With Bryan leading the charge, these opponents of the money changers, ignorant of Baruch's tutelage, now threw themselves behind Democrat Woodrow Wilson. They and Bryan would soon be betrayed. During the presidential campaign, the Democrats were careful to pretend to oppose the Aldrich bill. As Representative Lewis McFadden, himself a Democrat, as well as chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, explained it 20 years after the fact.
The Aldrich bill was condemned in the platform. When Woodrow Wilson was nominated, the men who ruled the Democratic Party promised the people that if they were returned to power, there would be no central bank established here while they held the reins of government. 13 months later, that promise was broken, and the Wilson administration, under the tutelage of those sinister Wall Street figures who stood behind Colonel House, established here in our free country the worm-eaten, monarchical institution of the King's Bank, to control us from the top downward and to shackle us from the cradle to the grave.
Once Wilson was elected, Morgan, Warburg, Baruch, and company advanced a new plan, which Warburg named the Federal Reserve System. The Democratic leadership hailed the new bill, called the Glass-Owen Bill, as something radically different from the Aldrich Bill. But in fact, the bill was virtually identical in every important detail. In fact, so vehement were the Democratic denials of...
Are these politicians paying any attention what they are passing, huh? Maybe they need to go for a little 9-day holiday in an island and do things.
Similarity that Paul Warburg, the father of both bills, had to step in to reassure his paid friends in Congress that the two bills were virtually identical.
Virtually identical.
Brushing aside the external differences affecting the shells, we find the kernels of the two systems very closely resembling and related to one another.
But that admission was for private consumption only. Publicly, the money trust trotted out Senator Aldrich and Frank Vanderlip, the president of Rockefeller's National City Bank of New York and one of the Jekyll Island Seven, to oppose the new Federal Reserve System. Years later, however, Vanderlip admitted in the Saturday Evening Post that the two measures were virtually identical.
Although the Aldrich Federal Reserve Plan was defeated when it bore the name Aldrich, nevertheless, its essential points were all contained in the plan that finally was adopted.
As Congress neared a vote, they called Ohio attorney Alfred Crozier to testify.
Man, he was pretty confident. A couple of years later, at the end of his days, he was like, yeah, we did that. We were pretty smart. We were pretty genius. Or maybe he was kinda... It was weighing on his heart and mind. And on his deathbed, he started to remorse what he did to humanity. But it kinda sounded like he was, like, proud what he did. Yeah, we went to Jekyll Island. And he wanted to let everybody know, like, I did this.
Crozier noted the similarities between the Aldrich Bill and the Glass-Owen Bill.
The bill grants just what Wall Street and the big banks for 25 years have been striving for: private instead of public control of currency. It, the Glass-Owen Bill, does this as completely as the Aldrich Bill. Both measures rob the government and the people of all effective control over the public's money, and vest in the banks exclusively the dangerous power to make money among the people scarce or plenty.
During the debate on the measure, senators complained that the big banks were using their financial muscle to influence the outcome. There are bankers in this country who are enemies of the public welfare, said one senator. What an understatement. Despite the charges of deceit and corruption, the bill was finally snuck through the Senate on December 22, 1913, after most senators had left town for the holidays after having been assured by the leadership that nothing would be done until long after the Christmas recess.
This just makes the decisions for the most powerful country in the world. What a fucking shit show.
On the day the bill was passed, Congressman Lindbergh prophetically warned his countrymen that
this act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this bill, the invisible government by the monetary power will be legalized. The people may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed. The worst legislative crime of the ages is perpetrated by this banking bill.
On top of all this, only weeks earlier, Congress had finally passed a bill legalizing income tax. Why was the income tax law important? Because bankers finally had in place a system which would run up a virtually unlimited federal debt. How would the interest on this debt be repaid? Never mind the principal. Remember, a privately owned central bank creates the principal out of nothing. The federal...
But think about the roads. Think about the army that's gonna freaking defend your nation. Taxation is very important. Shh.
government was small then. Up to then, it had subsisted merely on tariffs and excise taxes. No, just as with the Bank of England, the interest payments had to be guaranteed by direct taxation of the people. The money changers knew that if they had to rely on contributions from the states, eventually the individual state legislatures would revolt and either refuse to pay the interest on their own money or at least bring political pressure to bear to keep the debt small.
It is interesting to note that in 1895, the Supreme Court had found a similar income tax law to be unconstitutional. The Supreme Court even found a corporate income tax law unconstitutional in 1909.
And now we just freaking gotten used to it over the century or so. Nobody even thinks about it. Think about the roads. Think about the good that taxes. The welfare state, the high standard of living civilization. Think about the roads. Taxation is awesome.
Result, Senator Aldrich hustled a bill for a constitutional amendment allowing income tax through the Congress. The proposed 16th Amendment to the Constitution was then sent to the state legislatures for approval. But some critics claim that the 16th Amendment was never ratified by the necessary 3/4 of the states. In other words, the 16th Amendment may not be legal. But the money changers were in no mood to debate the fine points. By October of 1913, Senator Aldrich had hustled the income tax bill through Congress. Without the power to tax the people directly and bypass the states, the Federal Reserve Bill would be far less useful to those who wanted to drive America deeply into their debt. A year after the passage of the Federal Reserve Bill, Congressman Lindbergh explained how the Fed created what we have come to call the business cycle and how they use it to their advantage.
To cause high prices, all the Federal Reserve Board will do will be to lower the rediscount rate, producing an expansion of credit and a rising stock market. Then, when businessmen are adjusted to these conditions, it can check prosperity in mid-career by arbitrarily raising the rate of interest. It can cause the pendulum of a rising and falling market to swing gently back and forth by slight changes in the discount rate, or cause violent fluctuations by a greater rate variation. And in either case, it will possess inside information as to financial conditions and advanced knowledge of the coming change, either up or down. This is the strangest, most dangerous advantage ever placed in the hands of a special privileged class by any government that ever existed. The system is private, conducted for the sole purpose of obtaining the greatest possible profits from the use of other people's money. They know in advance when to create panics to their advantage. They also know when to stop panic. Inflation and deflation work equally well for them when they control finance.
Congressman Lindbergh was correct on all points. What he didn't realize was that most European nations had already fallen prey to the central bankers decades or centuries earlier. But he also mentions the interesting fact that only 1 year later the Fed had cornered the market in gold. This is how he put it, quote, "Already the Federal Reserve banks have cornered the gold and gold certificates," close quote. But Congressman Lindbergh was not the only critic of the Fed. Congressman Louis McFadden, the chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee from 1920 to 1931, remarked that the Federal Reserve Act brought about
a superstate controlled by international bankers and international industrialists acting together to enslave the world for their own pleasure.
Yeah, that's how it happened. Tomorrow we back. Let's go outside. Touch grass. Let sunshine tickle your balls or tits. Get some oysters, salmon, some raw chicken. We're gonna need it to take these guys picking our beach.